I just wanted to start by saying thanks to the collaboration of the libraries, the regional libraries, that's made this possible, because it's great that libraries do support authors so well. And thanks, Vicky, for that prompt to get everybody to sign up and be a member of the local library. I'm sure Clem also appreciates libraries, and it's making it possible for us to be beaming to you tonight from different areas of Melbourne into regional Victoria. So thanks everybody for joining us, and welcome Clem Bastow.
Thanks, Claire. And yes, I echo everything you just said. I was so thrilled to start seeing Late Bloomer pop up in libraries. For me, that's the real, bestseller status. So yeah, it's great to be here, especially because until very recently, I couldn't go to regional Victoria, or anywhere for that matter. So yeah, it's great. But I think what we might do tonight is start with a reading from the book and then keep chatting. What do you reckon, Claire?
I think that would be a great idea, because the book has come out, it's not a new book this year, and it'd be fabulous for people who maybe haven't read it or have read it, but it was a while between reads, to sort of reacquaint themselves, and maybe you too to reacquaint yourselves with your own writing.
Also,
lots of questions to ask you, and hopefully people in the audience will have them too. So remember what Vicky said, type in a question as soon as you think of it. But right now, Clem, take it away with a reading from the book.
Thank you very much, from my very sparkly book. All right, here we go. This is from the start, from the chapter, Well, How Did I Get Here? It's hard to qualify just how life-changing it is to receive an autism diagnosis well into adulthood. Suddenly, it was though I had a roadmap, translator, and code breaker all in one. Social interaction wasn't hard because I was a weirdo or defective. I literally lacked the neurotype for it. I wasn't losing it when I thought the room was too hot, or a noise was too loud, or a texture was revolting. My legendary childhood tantrums were, in fact, meltdowns, unstoppable reactions to sensory overload and anxiety. Most strikingly, my toughest challenges and my brightest talents suddenly had a root in something concrete. They weren't just things that had happened to me, they'd happened because of me. This was as thrilling as it was bittersweet. And yet part of me found being newly diagnosed an incredibly fragile state, like it was a precious object that might slip from my hands at any moment and shatter across the ground beneath me. As it turned out, there were not many incredulous reactions when I revealed the news of my diagnosis, first to family and then to friends. There were lots of, we've always suspected as much, and plenty of welcome to the club. My extended family contains a number of autistic people, in both the officially diagnosed sense and the sense of diagnosis being almost a moot point. Academia, it will not surprise you to hear, tends to be overpopulated by autists. My immediate post-diagnosis journey was similar to many who finally found clarity. I was very positive about it, with 3 exclamation marks, which was possibly a subconscious way of heading off any naysayers at the pass. I was determined to frame it as a good thing, both the fact of being diagnosed and the fact of being autistic, both of which I still absolutely believe, I must stress. A few months after receiving my autism licence, otherwise known as a diagnostic report, I was asked by Katie Coulis from Yellow Ladybugs, the fantastic autism advocacy group who work with young autistic girls and gender diverse kids, to give a speech at a mental health symposium they were running in February 2019. It wasn't the first time I had been out, professionally speaking, as autistic. I'd written a short reflective piece for The Age in late 2018. But it was my first involvement in an autistic-led event, my first time with my people, explicitly at least, and my excitement was palpable. I was asked to reflect on what I wish I'd known about myself when I was younger. The answer was, clear as day, I wish I had known I was autistic, which I wrote just like that, in caps and bolded in the notes for my speech. Friends and family of people who they suspect are on the spectrum often ask me, but won't they be labelled? It's true that growing up is difficult for everyone, except for maybe one school friend of mine who was a junior ballroom dancing champion. And a label like autistic or on the spectrum might seem scary to consider. But when you're well aware of the fact that you're very different from your peers, sometimes a label is the very thing you need. And besides, there are worse ones. Some of the labels that were applied to me included difficult, angry, selfish, remedial, incompetent, weird, and the evergreen Australian playground slur, spastic. One day I looked at my sports teacher's notes and discovered that I, who until that moment had enjoyed running, had inappropriate arm swing. Cue 15 straight years of avoiding sports and exercise. If someone had taken me aside at 10 or 15 and said something like, your brain is so good at some things, like art and performing, that it doesn't have much room left for others, like maths or socialising, a huge weight would have been lifted from my shoulders. Looking back at the speech I gave that day, I can see I was leaning heavily on the positives, partly in defense against the response I feared from friends and colleagues. Oh no, how do you feel now you know the terrible truth? Often, when autistic people focus on the positives, we're accused of having a rose-tinted view of the world. I won't lie to you, there are many challenges that I continue to face on a daily basis, even as an autistic woman with relatively low support needs. In the privacy of my own room, I'm still prone to meltdowns. Rest in peace, the DVD cover that I couldn't open, which I attacked with a chisel and a hammer shortly before jumping on it like Donald Duck having a spin out. It still didn't open. There are some behaviours and tics that I just don't talk about with non-autistic people because I know that to them they are utterly abject. It's interesting to return to that speech now as a snapshot of my headspace in the immediate afterglow of the vindication that diagnosis offered me. I hadn't yet gone deep into the world of autistic self-advocacy, and so much of the autistic experience, although I'd lived it my whole life, felt new to me. It was a constant process of, whoa, is that why I did/said/thought that? I was still learning the ropes. To discover or to be reassured that you're autistic when you're well into adulthood is to be pitched headfirst into paradoxical thinking. In one breath, I longed for the interventions and therapies that I missed, while in the other, I wished for all autistic children to be allowed to simply be as I was, more or less. This is the positionality of late life diagnosis. I was simultaneously subject and object, feeling things anew even as I was on the outside looking in. It took me a long time to stop questioning my own experience. Is that really an autism thing? Surely everyone goes through that. What if I'm not really autistic? And to start trusting the things that I now understood as uniquely autistic, and even then unique to my own experience, were in fact happening, and had happened my entire life. Even though I was a latecomer, I was still a valid member of the club. There is a tendency in some quarters to characterise accounts of later life diagnosis as being simply the end result of little more than feeling a bit different one's whole life. Surely, this thinking runs, these people are not truly autistic. After all, they managed to make it this far without being diagnosed. Many people are diagnosed later in life precisely because they've managed to do such an expert job of masking their autistic behaviours. For women and gender diverse people, this is often doubly true. What this misunderstanding of late life diagnosis misses, however, is the fact that diagnosis is usually sought because whatever facade the person has managed to maintain until that point has in fact begun to crumble. In the time leading up to my diagnosis, my experience of being in the world was becoming increasingly fraught in a way that went beyond merely being a bit awkward at parties. Human interaction and my inability to navigate it was wearing me down. At the same time, I'd taken on so much work, frantically trying to maintain my productivity as a measure of my worth, that I was coming apart at the seams. In November 2016, I experienced such profound physical and emotional exhaustion that my GP ordered me to stay in bed for a week. Even watching TV was deemed too taxing. Now I understand that as autistic burnout. At the time, it was a terrifying mystery. Occasionally, I wonder what might have been different had more time passed before deciding to pursue diagnosis, and thus learning what aspects of my life might be relevant to the clinician. As it stood, I was aware of some of the emerging thought regarding how autism can manifest in girls and women, but other aspects of my understanding were based on what I knew about the condition. I was only looking for the most obviously autistic behaviours in myself in order to report them. I think this is mostly because there's a part of me that knows how hard I've worked, not always consciously, to minimise and avoid so many of what I now recognise to be autistic behaviours, interests and ways of being. In a way, the mask was still firmly affixed when I stepped into the consulting rooms. It is, of course, a psychologist's job to be able to see beneath that facade, but when you're 36, they don't sit you in a room and observe you playing with dolls or model trucks. How many of my truly autistic behaviours were so innate, hidden or repressed that I wouldn't even think to mention them? Not long after my diagnosis, I recall seeing the autistic comedian Hannah Gadsby discussing her own experience, explaining that at home, free of the pressures of the world at large, she wasn't autistic. In a way, my experience was the opposite. I only felt safe to be truly myself in the safety of my own home. If only the clinician could have seen me plummeting into an internet hole, going deep on one of my special interests at the expense of things like rational thought or food. But there was another problem too. As Gadsby says in her stand-up special, Douglas, my issue was I didn't understand enough about autism to understand how I could have autism.
Thank you. That's given a great introduction to your book for people who haven't read it. And it's given me a lot to think about in terms of the questions that I'd love to ask you, because I thought I had all my questions worked out, but now it's made me think of a lot of other things, and it's making me wish I'd taken some notes, because I'm probably going to paraphrase you terribly. You said something very early on, possibly in the first couple of paragraphs, where you were talking about, the diagnosis gave you an understanding or sort of access to the worst parts of yourself, but also the brightest, the shining talents of yourself. And I just wanted to talk about that, because, quite often we do focus on the negatives, but there are so many positives that you are quite upfront about, acknowledging and celebrating. So tell us about those positives, but also how they balance and work with the other stuff.
Yeah, so I think a lot of what we understand, we speaking, collectively about autism, is often filtered through the media and through narratives that we read about. And they are often one of two things. It's either the unrelenting tragedy of autism or the good doctor, the sort of the absolute brilliant, like savant kind of level, incredible person. And the reality for most of us is somewhere in the middle, and I think the problem is that still to this day, and there are some psychologists who I think are trying to kind of work towards a strengths-based model, but in order to be diagnosed, it comes through what we call a deficit model. So it's all about your challenges, what is difficult for you, what you can't do, what you don't like. And so I think that often for people who are diagnosed later, and I think also for any person who's diagnosed or parent of somebody who's diagnosed, friend, family, is that you're not given much good news. I was lucky that the psychologists who diagnosed me, they were very positive, and so it was delivered as congratulations, it's autism. But I can recognize now that I know more about myself that there are a lot of aspects of things that I have made my life's work. So for example, now talking to you, I love to perform. So I think that's often something that's quite hard for people to understand. They might see an autistic person who's an actor or a teacher, something that involves, a kind of public-facing persona. Chloe Hayden's a great example. She's a fantastic young autistic advocate. She's starring in the upcoming Netflix Heartbreak High, and she sort of talks about how, when you're in your special interest or you're in your kind of strengths, you're very functioning. But, outside of that, you can have quite a lot of challenges. So I think for me, some of those skills were that, I think I've always been, the focus that comes with autism, I think has been really helpful for me, particularly in academic writing. And I think in my general journalism as well. But I can see how some of the kind of connections I'm able to make between things that seem quite disparate. To me, that's an autistic kind of associational way of thinking. So if somebody says a word, I might think of something that reminds me of that word, that might be a line from a movie or a picture I've seen. So I sort of talk about my mind as being, Temple Grandin calls it a kind of internet of pictures. It's sort of like Google image search. So for me, I'm constantly finding those points of connection, and I think that's been really helpful for my creative and for my non-fiction writing as well. So I think that's really important to keep in mind. And I think that's true of every autistic person, whatever their support needs are, whatever their communication needs are, they are going to have things that it's not necessarily things that you're good at, because I think often that gets kind of dangerous. It's like, how can I monetize something about my autism? But just that things that, these valuable, joyful, creative, eccentric, unique things about us that are really important. So I think that's something that I really encourage people to consider, is even a person who you may perceive to be, have a life full of struggle, there's still going to be things that they really enjoy, that they love. And that might just be swimming in a swimming pool for an hour every day. But that has value too.
Now, you sort of jokingly in that extract referred to, having your autism license. But I'm wondering if it did feel like suddenly, you were eligible for stuff, you had access, you had permission to do things, to access part of a world that wasn't yours before. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I think so. And I think the most important one is that it gives you, and I'm still working on it, but it gives you kind of permission, if you like, to take yourself seriously. So needs and challenges that I had, which I had previously just gone, I'm going to make myself go to the work event. I know I'm going to feel terrible tomorrow. I'll just push through it. Now I can kind of step back and go, do I need to go to that thing where I'm not necessarily going to make a connection that's going to lead to, paid work, or is it going to be useful for me? I think that's been the biggest thing, is to recognize that sensory difficulties that I have, social difficulties, that they're real. And so being able to kind of step back and go, what do I need from this? And for me, often with events, I love doing Zoom things because I'm in my house, so this is a very safe space. But when I go and do stuff in the public, I would often find that I would get really stressed. I'd get confused, lost, I couldn't find my way. I had an experience recently at a writers' festival, which was in every way terrific, but I got lost on the way to the venue. And that wasn't something that anybody had kind of factored in, that maybe it would be good to have really, really clear instructions. And so now I ask, can I have a visual schedule? Show me a picture of the building, show me a picture of the door that I have to go in. Nothing is too obvious. And so that's been really helpful, I think, because it was this thing that I always just was like, why is it so stressful to go and do my job? Like, why am I always getting lost? Isn't there, and it felt like something that I was responsible for. But to have that autism license means I can ask for those access considerations. I can ask to not have an event somewhere that's really super loud and I'm not going to be able to understand anything that's going on. So I think that's been the biggest thing.
You've mentioned in a few different ways, both just in chatting with me, but also when you read the extract, about the diagnosis giving you, I guess, a better understanding of yourself. And even when you referred to your family finding out about it, members of your extended family or friends going, oh yes, they expect it, or they recognized it. And it was really you that had to catch up with the understanding. Having not had a diagnosis like this myself, I obviously can't speak for you, but I'm imagining that if you have a diagnosis like this later in life, it is more about you and you coming to terms with it and you embracing yourself and accepting it and understanding it. And there's a real value in that. Whereas if you're a young child and the diagnosis comes then, it's almost like the benefit of that diagnosis is more for the people around that child, because it informs the way they respond to that child. That child. What are your thoughts around that? Because you mentioned also that, there was a kind of longing that if you had been diagnosed earlier, you would have had access to interventions or different things.
Yeah, for me, I think, even just the fact of having had that self-knowledge early would have been helpful. Because I think, I look at some of my younger autistic friends who were diagnosed, in their teens or earlier, and I think they were able to work through, to a sense of kind of autistic pride that I think is really a recent thing for me. Because unfortunately, when you don't know a really crucial bit of information about yourself, you do tend to become, I think, very self-critical. So it's, what's wrong with me? Why am I so weird? Why is this thing difficult? Why, et cetera, et cetera. And that kind of swirls around you as well, because you might act in ways that seem, unpredictable or bizarre or that are sort of wrong in inverted commas. So I think that sort of bittersweet quality of diagnosis is really true. And I think it is largely, but not entirely, a self-knowledge thing when you're older. I mean, I think it will amaze you to hear, Claire, there are very, very few supports for adult autistic people. So, I mean, in terms of coming out the other side of diagnosis and having access to anything, there really wasn't a lot. So in that sense, it is more about understanding yourself and being able to communicate that understanding to other people, I think. So, I look back and I think I probably had relationships where either they, intimate relationships or friendships or workmates, whatever, where I probably did behave in quite strange ways because I didn't know who I was, so I could sort of only hope to try and do what I thought I had to do. But yeah, I think for young people, I think it is really important that you have that kind of understanding wrapped around the person. And so yeah, that's something that I think I would have loved. But I mean, my parents were great. So in some ways, I'm not sure what difference it would have made. And it probably would have been a very different approach in the 80s than it is now too.
Oh, absolutely. I'd love to dig into that just a little bit more though before we move on to something else, because I guess there are some parents, you know, who may be tuned in tonight, I'm not sure, or teachers who may recognize, you know, traits that
Mhm.
a young person, and maybe somebody in that young person's life is in denial or doesn't want to, you know, face that issue, and so they're not seeking that diagnosis, and because they may have the belief that they don't want to pigeonhole somebody, they don't want to label them. But you would say still, though, you think it's better to have that support and have that identification and have what you said, you know, wrapped around that person still.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the caveat is always, particularly for older people, it's really expensive and it's difficult to get a diagnosis. So I always kind of, that's the asterisk. But I think yeah, for young people, there I recognise that concern, and I've spoken to, you know, friends and family members who have got kids who are maybe, you know, sort of 10 or in their early teens, wrestling with this idea of will it help them to know this about themselves. And I think the thing to remember is, you know, it's not like you're sending them into school with a big hat on that says autistic. Like, I know some kids who they know that's their diagnosis. They can discuss that with their teachers and their supports, and their family, but it's not, you know, they don't sort of go in trumpeting it. So it's not necessarily that suddenly everybody has to know, but I think that self-knowledge is so important for kids, because, you know, kids are, school's a nightmare. And, you know, when you're autistic, and especially when you don't know you are, I think you can be kind of like, um, zeroed in on by less scrupulous peers for bullying. You know, I was bullied, I was outcast, and so I think having that knowledge is really important. And I think, yeah, I understand the reticence, you know, because I think we still live in a world where people would prefer that autistic people didn't exist. Like, I don't think that's a huge stretch. Like, if you look at the so-called gold standard early interventions, they're basically geared towards making a kid seem less autistic. And the studies are increasingly showing that that's not how it works. You know, you might be able to kind of slightly keep a lid on it, but it doesn't address those core reasons for those behaviours. So let's say somebody doesn't want to go to school. You know, forcing them to go to school and sort of grin and bear it isn't necessarily going to help them. And it's the same with things like making people make eye contact or say good morning or whatever, you know, at what cost. So I do think that there's some terrific stuff that is really useful for kids, but I think I can understand why there is that kind of reticence around diagnosis when everything around us in society, beyond those occasional moments of the sort of brilliance narrative, tells us that autism is a big tragedy.
Yeah.
I think that's changing. You know, I think as we get more autistic-led, particularly screen media, things like Josh Thomas's show, Everything's Going to Be Okay. You know, Hannah Gadsby. There've been some really great little short films. I think that's really helping. It's sort of moving it away from the, you know, a current affair model of, you won't believe, you know, the awful life of this family with their autistic kid. Like, I think for a long time that was really where we received our information around it. And I'm someone who's very media literate. So, you know, for me to look at the screen media and go, well, I'm not autistic because I'm not like Rain Man or I'm not like Sheldon. So you can understand how your average person on the street is probably, you know, just thinking that as much, if not more, you know. I've seen autism on TV and that's not what I have, or that's not what my kid has, or I don't want them to have that. So
Yeah.
I think, I think it is important, but yeah, with certain kind of, you know, caveats around accessibility to diagnosis. And I hope that changes.
And you see it changing, though. You think it's changed. Well, obviously, you said, you know, had you been diagnosed in the 80s, treatment would have been very, very different back then. Have you seen it change even in recent times since you've had your sort of, you know, eyes and ears attuned more to what's happening? You know,
My radar switched on. Yeah, I think there's some really great, you know, professionals, clinicians, speech and language pathologists who are working within a strengths-based model, who recognize that unfortunately the diagnostic model that we have is pretty, you know, negative and viewed through that kind of prism of lack. I mean, you can't, like, it's, I think sometimes people think that what we mean when we say, you know, strengths-based is that we're just going, oh, well, there's nothing wrong with autism, it's a walk in the park. You know, that's not true. And there are difficulties and challenges, but I think it's recognizing that balance, and not just framing it as something that's wrong. It's just a difference, you know.
Now, I'd love to dig more into the writing of your book, Late Bloomer. It came out last year, didn't it?
Yeah, July last year.
Now, in the book's opening pages, you explain the difference between what you refer to as identity first language and person first language. And I'm just wondering, for people who aren't familiar with those terms, can you give us a little bit more detail and explain exactly what they mean to you, and why you made the language choices you did when you were writing this book?
Yeah, absolutely. So identity first is, in this context, calling myself an autistic person. So I am autistic. Person first is person with autism, person living with autism, person who has autism. And what identity first essentially kind of reflects is the idea that I can't separate myself from autism. It's such a key part of my being. And it also, I think, it's like a subtle shift where, if you say somebody has autism or they suffer from autism, it's a bit like saying somebody has a disease. Whereas if you say, if it's identity first, I think it kind of reframes it a bit as something which is an important part of you, and you can have something that there's a treatment for or a cure for, but if you are something, I think that kind of is a helpful, it's subtle, but it's a political thing. It's to say, autistic people are valid, and their lives have value, not in spite of autism. So it's not that you have terrible challenges, but you're really good at drawing. Like, it's like autism is a large part of you. It's not everything, and I think Hannah Gadsby talks about that really well. But it's an important part of who you are. And I think there's a move towards identity first. I think person first language is often used for good intentions. It's not something that has come from a mean place. And I think where it comes from often is parents or teachers who are worried about, again, it's that idea of being labelled. So they sort of see saying you have autism or that person first as kind of a gentler approach, but in a funny way, it sort of tries to separate the person from autism. And whatever the manifestation of autism is in your life, and as the famous phrase goes, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. But it's such an important part of what makes you who you are, for better and for worse. So I think I'm really pleased that increasingly that seems to be the norm, and I'm finding that as somebody who uses identity first language, I'm not being corrected as much. Like, I've had experiences in the past where I've been, on Talkback Radio, and somebody will text in going, "Oh, stop calling her an autistic. She has autism," and I'd have to like gently correct them and say, no, it's fine. I'm happy to be called autistic, because it's not, to me, it's not a bad thing. So yeah, I think that's I think you're starting to see that a bit more, which is great, because it's just one of those little subtle shifts that just reframes the idea of the role that autism plays in somebody's life.
You mentioned before at the start, when you were reading the extract, you were reflecting in the extract on a speech that you'd written, and you were sort of questioning yourself about how your relationship had changed, to your own diagnosis, even from writing that speech. I'm wondering now, tonight, with you reading an extract from your book that you said you really haven't connected to in that way for a while, how does your own reflection on your diagnosis feel, hearing you write about it when you wrote then, reflecting on something else that you'd done before that?
It's really interesting. I wrote a piece for Harper's Bazaar recently, which I think is out now, or it's maybe in the next issue. And it was kind of thinking about that, like that I have this almost quite ambivalent relationship to diagnosis because of the difficulties a lot of people have in accessing it. And so I'm in this funny situation where I've written this book. It's literally the subtitle of the book, How an Autism Diagnosis Changed My Life. But in a way, I think now a more accurate title would have been How an Autism Diagnosis Changed My Life Story, because I think it was more about that understanding of things that I'd been through and that I go through, rather than a kind of light bulb moment. I mean, it is in some ways. But yeah, I think reflecting on that now, I think there's more nuance in it. I think at the time that I wrote that speech, I was super positive. When I wrote the book, I think I was still, and I still think it's, I certainly haven't cooled on the idea, and I think it is important, but I think it's more just that recognizing how difficult it is for a lot of people to access it. But I think you know, I mean, the self-diagnosis thing is a really tricky area, and I don't sort of tend to weigh into it, because I think for some people that's all they've got. And I think it's a really important step on the way to diagnosis. So I think that you see a lot of people who, I was one of them, you know, I started to read about it. I was like, I think this is me. And then I, you know, pursued a screening, and I was lucky to get in with a psychologist. So yeah, it's kind of interesting to have written this book, which I guess is the sort of teachable moment from it is being diagnosed late in life. But I think that there's a lot more to it. And I sort of hope that soon, you know, we'll start talking more just about the autistic experience and not of that kind of clinicalized, you know, fact of diagnosis. But I also can't deny that it's a hugely important thing. So it's really tricky, and it's quite nuanced. But I think, yeah, it's you know, in some ways it feels like the book came out yesterday, and I guess part of that was because it came out just before lockdown, before our snap lockdown.
In a time warp.
Yeah, so it does feel like kind of time folded in on itself a bit, but yeah, I think I've come to a place which is a nice mix of the two. You know, I was very positive. Then there was that sort of period of mourning, of what ifs and sliding doors moments and stuff. And I think now I've kind of passed through that, which is a great place to be.
Now, you mentioned teachable moments, and I'm sure there's many more than just one teachable moment in your book. You're being self-deprecating in that. One thing you do explore is your autism diagnosis from a female perspective. You know, it's a unique perspective, and I'm wondering, for the audience who maybe haven't read it yet, who may have somebody in their life, I'd love to hear your thoughts about how you believe the different challenges are, or the different benefits too, I guess. But how do females present differently than males? There's a lot of masking, I understand, and
yeah. So I think what's really important to kind of note at the outset is that it can present in a certain way. So I think what happened when, this is all still very recent knowledge, it's really only barely 10 years old, this idea that autistic, particularly young girls, often are, compared to their male peers, seemingly very outgoing. You know, they often might seem quite confident. What we do is sort of a form of camouflage, where often we will look at a popular person at school or a character in a film or a TV show that we like, and kind of model ourselves on them, sometimes to almost like a mimicry extent. And so that's become this quite contested thing, where the DSM, the big diagnostic manual of psychology, is you know, planning to kind of dial some of that back, essentially because I think there are still some stick in the mud psychologists who don't believe that people who are outgoing are autistic. And so that's a big thing. And then the kind of the weight of that then becomes this idea of masking. So you are pretending to be essentially somebody else because that gives you social capital. And of course, the terrible, awful irony is it doesn't really, you know, it's not all that successful. I mean, I thought I was being, you know, very cool, and ultimately I was like that how do you do fellow kids meme, because, you know, the things that I was looking at to teach myself how to interact with other people were like Blackadder. You know, what 8-year-old kid in 1989 was like, it's hilarious in retrospect, but at the time that was how I was kind of surviving school. So that's a big one. You know, I think a terrible aspect of the sort of gendered presentation of autism is that I think young female autistics are uniquely, like, this is a studied thing, you know, uniquely vulnerable to predators. I think they can just clock you as being sometimes a little bit naive, you know, and that's another reason why I think if I'd had that self-knowledge earlier in life, that's, I think, the most difficult thing for me is, I think, would I have avoided some of those terrible situations if I'd known that about myself? I think they probably still would have been attracted to me, but maybe I would have been able to kind of head that off at the path, rather than just trusting that every person, you know, wasn't actually the big bad wolf dressed as grandma. Like, so yeah, I think that's been a big thing, and again, it's got a lot to do with the idea of autism that we get both through popular media and through the clinical literature. So that idea of the sort of Sheldon character is baked into the diagnostic criteria, and has been from the get-go, because people like Hans Asperger were predominantly working with young boys. So to the point where some psychologists actually did believe that it didn't exist in girls. And so that was a thing that I asked a psychologist when I was writing the book, who had been active in autism in the 80s. I said, look, let's say this, one of these many sliding doors moments where the teacher noticed something a bit weird. If we'd sought a diagnosis, what would have happened? And she said it was almost unheard of, at that time, if a young girl didn't also have an intellectual disability, for autism to even be considered. So chances are I would have been misdiagnosed, even though I had a number of very autistic behaviours as a kid. And so, yeah, it is a recent thing. And fortunately, I think there's been some really great work, and particularly in Australia, at the sort of gendered presentation of autism. But I think what's important to remember is it's not always the same. So I know a lot of, female autistics who are Rain Man, who have that classic kind of male, they're very brusque, they're interested in weird stuff, they're super kind of regimented. And conversely, I know, male autistics who are very outgoing, that they have that sort of feminine presentation. So I think it's more about understanding that there's just different ways that autism can present. But having said that, most of the people that I know who are, women or, AFAB, gender diverse people who grew up as girls, we all have very similar experiences, which is, that you're this sort of chatty, weird, outgoing, kind of eccentric young person. And the other thing is that that's a really important one, I think, for parents and teachers to understand, is that the idea of the special interest, which is a cornerstone of autism diagnosis, traditionally in young boys, we think of that as like crazy about light switches or really into trains, and it's always something a bit offbeat, whereas in girls it can often be dismissed as girls stuff. So for me, I was really into My Little Ponies. It seems normal, so you've already been kind of assumed to be not autistic at that point. So a young autistic girl who's really, really super into BTS or One Direction, that might just be dismissed as, oh, it's just girl stuff, she's just. But if you sort of scratch a bit deeper, the level of the focus and the obsession is sort of way outweighs what her so-called typical peers might be experiencing. So that's a really important one to look out for, I think, is to just kind of have a look at those what they call circumscribed interests and just kind of suss that out. Like, is this just she's a fan of Harry Styles, or does she have 5,000 photos of Harry Styles on her phone? Like, things like that to just keep an eye out for, and just be really careful to not dismiss things as, all girls are like that, or that's just girl things.
Now, I definitely want to make time for people in the audience to be able to ask you questions. So if everyone who is tuned in does have a question for you and they haven't yet typed it in the chat, please do, because we'll come to them in a couple of minutes and make sure that we've got time before we wrap up around 7:30. But I've got a couple more questions for you myself, Clem, because I wanted to ask you, as a fellow writer, about how you approach the writing of Late Bloomer. I'm wondering, how many incarnations of it were there? Did you sort of, immediately get the format of how you decided to tell the story? Because it kind of time travels. You kind of you flip through time in the book, for people who haven't read it. I've heard you call it a time traveling memoir, really. It starts in the now. You move forward to gaze into the future. You reflect back on your life. Tell me about that approach to choose to write it like that.
Yeah, that was something that I think was always in my mind, but it took a while to work out how to do it. So the first draft was quite different. It was very chronological, and it was quite a different tone. I think it was a real, I would be happy to call it a bummer. It was sad, a bit bitter, I think I had to kind of expunge the demons a bit. But I often find that happens with my writing, that the first draft is kind of like, I read it and I'm like, is that me? Like, it's almost like you have to kind of shake off the version that you don't want published. And then there was this sort of funny experience where I handed that draft in and I was like, God, no, don't publish it, even though I knew they weren't going to, but it was like this kind of near miss. And then I was really lucky working with Arwen and Anna, and to kind of peel back some of the kind of the stuff that I didn't want to use, and to sort of look at, okay, well, what are the raw materials that we've got here? And I think from then it was about finding a kind of structure for it, and I think having those themed chapters really helped. So although it's sort of broadly chronological in a sense, I wanted to have each chapter kind of do a lot of heavy lifting. So I knew that I had a story about being crazy about Ghostbusters when I was, 7, 8, 9. And I thought, well, that could be a good opportunity to use echolalia, because I used to say all the lines from it all the time. So I wanted to use my experiences as kind of contextualizing information for these aspects of autism that for a lot of us are kind of a mystery. We might, we hear these phrases like special interests and stims and, sensory overload, but we don't necessarily know what that means. So I felt like I kind of wanted to use my memoir as a way to kind of help illustrate some of these things, because I didn't want it to just be my story. I wanted it to be a kind of blend of memoir and non-fic in that way, because I think I'd done a lot of personal essay stuff in my work and felt like the well was a bit dry in that sense. So I think finding that theme and structure was really important. And then from then, I think really the bulk of the writing happened in the second draft and onwards. And I think that's something that, I guess, maybe coming from a journalistic background, I really like the editing process, because it makes you look like a better writer. We would all love to believe that the Pulitzer worthy thing just falls out on the first draft, but a lot of it is having an editor who's able to go, I think what you're trying to say here is, X, Y, Z. And that was exactly what happened with this. So I think that was really useful. But yeah, that time traveling thing, I wanted to reflect, for me, a way that I find my kind of autistic way of thinking works, which is I'm often it's almost like I'm in different temporalities all at once. So sort of daydreaming about the past and the future while I'm in the present. So that was really important. And I think, I recently reviewed Hannah Gadsby's memoir for the conversation, and I talked about how it's not about autism, but it's written in a very autistic way. And I'm really pleased that that's starting to become a thing. Also, Emma Jane's memoir, Diagnosis Normal, does a similar thing. They're both people who've been diagnosed later in life, but unlike my book, it's not so much about that as it is just autistic in nature. I think mine's both. Mine is autistic in its structure, and it's also about that. But it's really exciting to start to see autistic writers now who are able to just write autistically and not necessarily have to frame that 100% around autism.
But with memoir, and I mean, you've done a lot of personal essay writing, as you mentioned, there's different challenges, I guess, that come up. You said then about having that first draft and wondering if you sound too bitter or too gloomy, or, if you're, lamenting those sliding door moments too much. There's things that come up with memoir where you are, I guess, critiquing the people around you and how they've responded to you. How much do you think about that and any impact that,
a lot.
Somebody else. Too much.
A lot in some cases. With my family, it was really hard. I think because it's, they played an important part in my life, but it's not about them. And I felt ethically like it was a real balance to strike. So in a way, I was worried when I sent, a version of the book to them, that they would feel like they weren't present. And that really concerned me, that I would feel like people would read it and go, where's her family? She doesn't talk about them at all. But what I was sort of trying to do was protect them in a way, I think. But it's also...
You didn't want readers to think, oh, her family didn't recognise it, or also you left them out because of that? Or
I think there was a bit of that.
We're viewing it through a very different lens now, that there is this heightened awareness.
Yeah, I think there was a bit of that, and I think Mum was worried about that people would think, oh, how could they have not seen it? They tried their best, like any family who it's not like I thought I was autistic for years and they said no. I do know people who've had that experience, and that's terrible. Like, we just never really quite knew we knew there was something, but we didn't know what it was. But I think it was more because it's sort of like a single topic memoir in a way. So for me, if I was writing my memoirs, I probably would have done more direct, almost like interviewing people who were important to the story. But I felt like because this was a memoir of me being autistic, there were lots of things that I could kind of keep private. From, I could have talked about that great family holiday that we had, but that's a beautiful thing for us to share, and it didn't necessarily, I think, I'm sure it would have been great to have in there, but just stuff like that. So it was sort of like working out what to hold back on. You know, then there were some people who were kind of villains, where I just thought, you blew it. Like, I don't care. And I don't know, you know, there's one or two people who I sort of thought, I wonder if they've read it. I don't know. But yeah, I think it's always tricky with memoir. But sometimes I read memoirs and I just think, you know, it's got kind of direct quotes in it. And I think, how do you know? Like, are you putting words in that person's mouth? Do you have a photographic memory? And so that I couldn't kind of get past. I didn't want to write my version, and I'm a screenwriter, so it's not like I can't write dialogue, but I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to go, well, I'll write the conversation that we all had around the dinner table in 1997, because I couldn't remember. It would be a sort of simulacrum of it, and I didn't want to do that.
Yeah.
Now, but I don't know if I'd write a memoir again.
Every time you tell a story, I come up with other questions, but I have to make sure that nobody in the audience has their own questions to get in first, because I don't want to step on those. So Vicky from La Trobe Library, are there any questions, or do you have a question yourself that you'd love to?
There is a question that's just come through from Beck. Hi Clem, love the book. The 80s references are a thrill. It's thoroughly researched from autistic viewpoints with an autistic daughter who's also a visual thinker. Is there anything on reflection that would have supported you in school?
Ooh, yeah. I mean, I it's something I think about, because I teach uni students, but they're often, you know, first or second year, so they're still quite young. And I think it's still quite, it's not uncommon, but it's not as prevalent as it should be for teachers to think about different ways of learning. So for me, you know, when I'm putting together a class, I always make sure there's some imagery, you know, there's some text. I read any text aloud, and I'm sort of hopefully in that way, you know, including people who learn different ways. Yeah, it's tricky because so much of contemporary schooling, well, it's not very contemporary, you know, it's very focused on things like maths, and I love to write, but you know, not always in the way that I was supposed to be writing. So yeah, I think that's a really hard thing, but I would hope that, you know, your daughter will hopefully learn to kind of harness that in her own way. And, you know, that might be creative writing. It could be all sorts of things. I think that visual thinking is very different and unique. And you know, autistic people aren't the only people who think visually, but I think the way that we think visually is different. And everybody describes it in different ways, but you know, that Temple Grandin thing of the Google image search, or the sort of Filofax full of pictures, is that's kind of a common thread, that people describe it in these interesting ways. So I think encourage her to think of that as a strength, even if it doesn't always feel like one at school. And it's tricky, you know. School is a bit of a is it a round hole or square hole, round peg, you know, trying to kind of force a lot of people into a very narrow idea of how we should learn. So I think if she can indulge in that way of thinking outside of school hours, I think that's really helpful to kind of to celebrate that quality. And congratulations to her and to you for the knowledge.
Now, Vicky, are there any other questions for now?
There is. This one is from Jessie. Not so much a question. I just wanted to thank you for this book. I'm 37 and was diagnosed last year, and I'm trying to shift my thinking away from, but I'm not autistic enough, to embracing it and claiming it, and you've really helped. My God, your research. Thank you, in capital letters. Also, Blackadder, especially Baldrick, is cool. And I agree.
Very cool. Yeah, look, I think the I'm not autistic enough thing is a huge thing, and I know so many people who, you know, I interviewed. If you go to the end of the book, there's a hashtag actually autistic epilogue, where I talked to a number of people who had all very different experiences of autism, and you would be surprised how many people think that. And I think it's often something particularly late diagnosed people have is a sort of an internalization of that thing that people say, where it's like, oh, but it's just because you're just a bit weird, you know. It's actually because we've done a great job. You know, Yen Furcus, who's an amazing autistic advocate, they say, you know, you've ABA'd yourself, and it's kind of true. You know, you've done so much hard work by the time you're diagnosed later in life to not seem autistic, because you didn't know that you were autistic, or maybe you know had an inkling, but in trying to kind of force those things to the back of your mind, you know, you often do quite a good job of not seeming autistic enough. But I think, you know, in your heart what the reality is, and hopefully that that journey post-diagnosis will just become more of an experience of autistic pride and joy. So yeah, congratulations again. Congratulations to everyone.
Vicky, any other questions?
Emma has said that she really enjoyed listening to the audiobook on BorrowBox, and did Clem enjoy the recording process?
It was fascinating, and I'm really, I mean, I think there was always going to be an audiobook, but I was really thrilled that I was able to do it. Fun fact, I did have to audition to read my own memoir. But it was almost like writing it again, because even though I do radio and stuff, there's a lot of stuff that I never say out loud. So I was sort of going through it and realizing how many Eastern European psychologists I'd quoted, whose names I was going to have to read out, and quotes from characters in science fiction whose names I'd never said aloud. But I think for me, it was a really nice process, because it happened obviously after the book was sent off to the printers. So it was a way, I think, of processing the experience of writing the memoir too, because when you're writing it and you're editing, it's kind of, very fresh in your mind, and you don't really have a chance to kind of reflect on what you've done. So I was really pleased that I got to read the audiobook, because I think that was a way of me kind of putting, not putting it to bed, but, coming out the other side of that and being like, the end. And then I was like, just ready to let it go out into the world. I think I might have had a more stressful experience if I hadn't had that opportunity. That thing of like, oh my God, my book's coming out. I don't even know what I wrote. It was, because often, you finish a book, you do the editing, it goes to the printers, and it might be 6 months or more until it comes out. So for me, I think having that period of reading the audiobook in the interim was really, it was a really nice, I mean, it was tough, because you don't always write stuff to read aloud. So some of these things was kind of like reading my diary. But yeah, it was great fun, and I'm really pleased that people have enjoyed the audiobook, because I think somebody described the narration as comforting, which I was like really chuffed by. So yeah, I loved it. I'd love to do another audiobook, but I don't know. I'm not sure that they've returned my calls.
That's probably another good reason why you didn't do all the different dialogue, because you would have had to do all the different accents.
Oh, exactly.
Especially the Eastern European psychologists. And
now I did it 17 times. It's the flow state guy. Mahai Chicksent Mahai. There you go. But we had, it was very fun. I had a producer with me the whole time, and he was often going to YouTube and going to some like mrpronounce.com. Turns out there's a lot of words I can't pronounce. I learned a lot about, because I've never seen a speech pathologist, and I learned there was lots of like letter combinations that I really struggle with. So it was fascinating. Also, I just love, you can probably tell, I like to talk. So yeah, I'll hopefully get to do some more podcasts or audio somethings in the future.
I'm sure you will. Now we're nearly up to time, but Vicky, is there any last questions?
There's a last comment. Rose has said that it's a juicy book and really well written, and thank you for sharing your story. And Kim has said thank you to everybody. Wonderful.
Oh, look, thank you to everyone for coming. It's so nice to, often you release a book, you sort of have a couple of parties, and that's sort of it. So I'm really pleased that it's still got a life of its own, and it's the feedback that I've had from other autistic people and family of autistic people has just been so affirming, and it says to me that the book's done what I wanted it to do, which was to speak to autistic people and to provide a kind of some context for their experience for other people to understand, and hopefully create some empathy. So I'm stoked.
Now, I've just got a couple of last questions for you.
Yes.
And one of them, because we are talking to a library audience and people who are obviously very interested in this topic, wondering if you've got any other book recommendations for people.
Well, here's so I'm currently doing my PhD. Yep. There's a really, I've read so many great things lately. I would really recommend Hannah Gadsby's 10 Steps to Nanette, Emma A. Jane's Diagnosis Normal. They're both absolutely fantastic. What else have I read? I've got an enormous to read book. So I'm doing my PhD in action cinema, so I'm reading a lot of stuff about that. There's a really fantastic book, and now I'm going to forget the title. There's two that I've used by two autistic. One is called Theorizing Autism Poetics, and the other one is called Authoring Autism. They've been great. You know, I would love more time to just read like fun fiction. I read a really sweet, is it Small Joys of Real Life by Ali Richards, which is like a little, it's kind of a, it's not really a rom-com. I think it's more of a coming of age book set in Melbourne. I really enjoyed that. But yeah, I'm looking forward to finishing my PhD, so I've got more brain space for reading. But yeah, those are at the top of my list.
Now, lastly, for anyone who might be on the precipice of exploring their own diagnosis, or perhaps the diagnosis of someone they love, because there's something earlier about, you know, what's really terrible is people who know that they are autistic, but they're trying to convince their loved ones, and they're in denial, and you said that's really terrible. So I'm wondering what advice you would give for people who are on the brink of that diagnosis.
I think trust in what has led you to that point, you know. Prepare yourself for what will probably be quite a struggle just to access it in the first place. But there are some really fantastic supports out there. Amaze's autism info line is really great, and you can ring up and talk to a hashtag actually autistic person. And I think surrounding yourself with autistic content, for want of a better word, is really helpful. So for me, that was like following other autistic advocates on Instagram and social media, watching films, you know, seeing whether or not you sort of feel like you align with that community. There's a great documentary on Netflix called Asperger's Are Us, which is about this autistic comedy troupe. And I remember watching that when I was thinking about getting diagnosed and just going, okay, yep, that's my people. So stuff like that I think is really important, and especially because they're sort of positive. You know, don't be kind of dissuaded by the negativity that is out there, and unfortunately sometimes comes from our nearest and dearest. And yeah, just believe in yourself, and good luck. You know, I think it's such a huge step to take, and I was really worried when I decided to pursue it. You know, I remember being quite embarrassed to talk to my GP about it in case she told me she thought I was barking up the wrong tree. And she said something really great. She just said, it's always good to know more about yourself. So, you know, chances are, I don't know of anyone, actually, I was going to say many people, I don't know of anyone who's gone, I think I'm autistic, I'm going to pursue diagnosis, who's been told they aren't. But, you know, just see it as an interesting process, and you'll learn something about yourself. You know, you may not end up with the official piece of paper autism license, but I think yeah, just kind of go gently on that journey, and it will be rewarding.
Now, I know you've got your book with you because you read from it. So now's your chance to, with shameless self-promotion, hold up that beautiful sparkle again. Well, I thank you, Clem Bastow, for sharing, you know, such honest and helpful stories. Thanks to all the libraries that collaborated to make this possible. Vicky Dowdo, thanks for wrangling the questions and making it all happen tonight. Thanks to everybody who's taken time out of their evening to join us. I'm sure you've enjoyed it. And of course, support your local library.
Absolutely.
I'm on the reservation list for Clem's book. Go buy Clem's book and just support authors and reading. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Claire. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for coming. I really appreciate it, because I know it's not lockdown anymore. So I think it's a big deal when people come to a Zoom event, and I hope they keep going, because they really are a great, accessible thing. So hopefully now we don't get, you know, Zoom PTSD anymore, and we can just enjoy getting together on our computers.
Thanks, Clem.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.